Let's have a look how the classes and the attributes of an ontological data model are being created. First, we are connecting to a server and to a database name using here a fictitious login and also fictitious password. We connect and we see here an overview of attributes, classes, and relations. Everything is empty so far. So let's start with creating a class. Let's call it historical person, because we want to create the genealogy of the royal houses in Europe, and so therefore we also need historical persons as a class. First we choose a class name, a schema in which it should be stored inside the database, and a table name, how that table should be called inside that database. We can give it a short description here, list of historical persons, or a longer one if you please. The other things, such as do not process, is simply a flag in order to keep with the EU GDPR guidelines. Also the do not delete before and delete after. And these dates are set for in the future, but you can always change them to something more present. The auto display columns we get to later once we have the necessary attributes created for that class. When we save that, all we get is a class, historical persons, but nothing else. When we click on that, we see there are no attributes yet to that class. Attributes are things like first name, last name, born when, etc. Let's create a few of those. First name, call it a data type nvarchar 40, that should do. Flag if that needs encryption, again flagged if that should not be processed or it should be processed. We do still need it, so we leave it unchecked. There can be a unit to a attribute, if it's liters or meters or kilometers, but of course with the first name there is no such thing. Save that, and here we have our first attribute. Let's create a second one. Well, guess what? Last name is always good. No unit again. Save, we have last name, and let's create a regal name such as Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, etc., etc. So in the meantime, I have added a few more attributes and also a few more classes. Now, this here is just a list of attributes that can be used in any class. That is also known as the domain data model, where you, for example, say, I want my first names always be nvarchar 40 long. I want my last names always be nvarchar 50 long. So there's no confusion when in any of those classes someone talks about a last name, it is always nvarchar 50. Now, we need to add these attributes now to those classes, or at least to some of them. And with if my mouse would click, I get the list of attributes that I have not added to that historical person yet, and say, okay, I want this. I here can indicate if it's a field that must be filled. I can indicate if I want this to be indexed for some reason for faster searches, or if I want this to have a default value. A default value, of course, with the first name doesn't really make any sense because not everyone is called Frank. So I say save, and at some point we will see that the classes are being added. Here I've just entered the first name as a attribute. I also need the last name. And I still have a little bit of a refresh problem here. But we see last name and first name disappeared, so they are added to that class called historical person. Gender is also interesting. And maybe the regional name that he used in order to... No, we need the year of the birth. And probably also the year that the person died, because in history people often never knew at what day they were born or what month. So the year is a good guess. I added a few more attributes to the class of historical persons. When we look into this, I added a wiki link, for example. But if you say, okay, we might need more, maybe a remark is also good to have. These other with underscore starting columns, they're being added automatically. Those are technical columns that are added to each and every of the classes that we have. As you see here, for example, in Kingdom, I only added the name as an attribute, and all the other underscore ID user, do not delete before, private synths are columns that are being, or attributes that are being added automatically for technical reasons. I also added a few attributes into Noble House, like, and here we see we can reuse the same attribute in different classes, because all of those attributes that we defined earlier here belong to the domain data model and can be reused as often as we want. Of course, in different classes, you cannot reuse the same attribute in the same class, because then you wouldn't know, are we talking about remark or are we talking about remark? So they need to be unique. Now you might ask yourself, why did we all that modeling of the classes and setting up the attributes? What has happened inside the database? Now, when we are going inside the database that we connected to earlier, that was the OntoDB core database, and have a look inside the tables, here we only see the tables that are needed in order to run the system. Inside this folder here, called Graph Tables, we now see there are a few tables that look familiar. The Historical Persons table, Kingdom table, and Noble House. And when we look inside those tables, we see the columns that we also saw earlier: first name, last name, gender, year of birth, etc., including the technical columns that I mentioned, plus even some more technical columns, internal SQL Server columns that are necessary for node tables. The graph tables consist out of node tables. They look like that. And out of edge tables that we do not have yet, and we get to see in my next video, where we then model the relationships between classes. Now, on the other hand, we also created an API, and the API comes along in form of stop procedures. And here we see a lot of stop procedures that I need in order to run the system, but also here in store, there we see a stop procedure to delete entries out of Noble House, to delete entries out of historical persons, but we also see here incident update procedures into historical person, kingdom, and noble house. So all of those structures are being automatically created when we set up a class or when we add attributes to the class. And when we look into the parameters, for example, of this, we again see a whole bunch of technical parameters, but also again first name, last name, gender, and so forth. And that is how we automatically create an API with which we then can interact with the tables that were created out of that graphical user interface.